Welcome once again to the world around us, and tonight is a very rare occasion. Those of you who've written in asking for repeats of programs would know that I always write back and say, no chance in the short term. Well, tonight we're changing the rules. When we first screened Brisbane, the hidden city, the response was truly extraordinary, quite unprecedented. So tonight we're going to do as you've asked, and we're going to once again delve into the colourful and fascinating history of the people and the events that have shaped the city that we now call home. When Brisbane was first founded, the area we now know as the City Hut was the centre of that early settlement too. It wasn't the ideal place for a settlement. It was hilly in some places, in others wet and swampy. Central to the siting of Brisbane was the river, which was to play a major role in many early events in the city. But it wasn't the river which caused all the early difficulties. It was in fact a creek which ran down to the river from the higher land on its banks. It was named Wheat Creek, but colonials called it just the Big Creek. It ran down from the area we now know as the Normanby Five Ways, draining the Petrie Terrace area, crossed what we now know as Roma Street, past Tank Street, which was named for the earth dam that was built across the creek to supply water, and into the swampy site of the present City Hall. From there, it swept in an arc from the current intersection of Albert and Adelaide Streets to the corner of Adelaide and Creek Streets, then down roughly where Creek Street runs today and into the river. As this city plan of 1855 shows, buildings began to spring up all around the creek, and it wasn't long before it became a foul-smelling open drain. The creek, which was then about 6 metres lower than the land is now, ran through the area bounded by Adelaide Street and the Queen Street Mall. And these alleyways that run off Adelaide Street dip down to what was then, 150 years ago, the original creek bed. The Big Creek was both a major flood hazard and a major contributor to the city's infant mortality rate, which was then the highest in the country. Water, which was piped from the Tank Street Dam, brought both progress and death to the city of Brisbane, because slops from butcher shops, the overflows from toilets and cesspits, and all the manure from the streets ended up in the Big Creek, quickly transforming it into a stinking sewer. But all that changed in February 1875, when two falls of greater than 170 millimetres or 7 inches over 24-hour periods were recorded. The creek overflowed and the deluge flooded Queen Street, causing massive damage. The outcry was loud, the reaction swift. Initial work began here, at the corner of Adelaide and Albert Street, as it was downstream from here that most property development had taken place. By the end of 1875, contractors had begun work on this, the first major drainage project in the city. From this intersection, this egg-shaped drain, about 2 metres high and 1 metre wide, runs all the way along Adelaide Street to the corner of Creek Street. It's crafted from handmade bricks, with side drains running into it, and is particularly popular with the city's cockroach population. At the corner of Creek and Adelaide Streets, the drain increases in size to almost 3 metres in diameter, again almost entirely constructed from brick. It runs into the Brisbane River between the Riverside Centre and Pier 9, and is affected by river tides for some distance back up Creek Street. The drain is exactly the same as the day it was completed in March of 1877, apart from maintenance carried out by the City Council. Numbers of smaller drains feed the colonial drain. Some of them even make a home for the occasional mud crab who's wandered in with the tide. But getting rid of water wasn't the only problem facing the early settlers. Sometimes there simply wasn't enough of the stuff. After Brisbane was declared to be no longer a penal settlement in February of 1842, and the population grew, demand for water was critical. The earth dam built across the big creek had sufficed for the smaller penal population, which was never more than about 1,200. The convict settlement had even developed a primitive reticulation system using hollow wooden logs. This is all that remains of that piping system, one small piece which has been carefully preserved by the Brisbane City Council. The first serious attempt to supply water to the growing colony took place in 1866 with the completion of the Enoggera Dam. But here, on the top of what was the most prominent high place in early Brisbane, is a curious reminder of the early days of Brisbane town. Simply known as the reservoirs, they were built to augment the inner city water supply.
Inside, they look so different from out. They're deep, they're dark, and they're cool. Each is reinforced by a series of these arches, magnificently constructed from handmade bricks. The first went up in 1871, the second was built in 1882. They were filled with water from Enoggera Dam. They were all reconditioned in about 1905 and were still used for the Brisbane city water supply as recently as 1962.
The walls are still in perfect condition, and except for the odd spider web, you get the feeling that the workmen who built this masterpiece 120 years ago may just have left, and the reservoirs are about to be filled. In the centre of Brisbane, in an area which was once the garden of early settler Andrew Petrie, stands a monument that's been controversial from the very day it was erected. Pictured here in 1880, the year it was completed, the memorial was thought to have been built in memory of the young American volunteer fireman, James Mooney. Mooney, just 22 years old, died from his injuries when a cask of spirits exploded while he was fighting a fire at Hughes' grocery store in Queen Street on the 23rd of March back in 1877. The story goes that grateful residents donated money to build the memorial drinking fountain. But because it was more than 2 years before it was completed, Mooney was forgotten, and a plaque showing the names of the councillors of the day was affixed. But there are those who argue that the fountain was never erected in the memory of Mooney, and the money which was raised went to build this, his grave, in the Toowong Cemetery. They argue that the inscription shows that the money raised from the public was used here, and not to build the drinking fountain, which is just that, a drinking fountain, with no other significance. Through the years, the passing parade of Brisbane people has watched the city change around the memorial, most hardly noticing the Gothic structure or knowing anything of the controversy. But in 1988, the year of the bicentennial, the Brisbane City Council made a stand and decided to add another plaque recognising Mooney, the hero of the Queen Street fire.
While we take it much for granted these days, Brisbane's Victoria Bridge has had a checkered and tragic history. It was to be built and rebuilt 5 times over a period of 104 years. These are some of the oldest known moving pictures of Brisbane. Taken in 1899, they show the northern end of the Victoria Bridge, the bridge known as the second permanent bridge. It was officially opened just 2 years earlier, in July 1897, by Lord Lamington. It was to be the beginning of the longest stable period of bridging the river, which had its beginnings 33 years earlier, when work first began on a cross-river structure. This early picture shows the first temporary bridge over the river, which was built as staging for the construction of the permanent bridge and also for vehicular traffic. It was opened in June of 1865, but within 2 years its wooden supports had been eaten away by marine borers. In November 1867, a Mr. Cinnamon was waiting at the North Quay Wharf for an upriver ferry. He tells how the Cobb & Co coach had just clattered across the bridge. There was an enormous straining of timbers, a crash, and the bridge collapsed, leaving the river strewn with debris. Well, for the next 6 years, Brisbane had to rely again on ferry crossings. But that meant the development of Brisbane's northern suburbs, as access to the popular south side was limited. Floodwaters of the great 1869 deluge were to delay the construction, but finally, on June the 15th, 1874, the first permanent bridge across the river was opened amidst great fanfare and celebration. Brisbane's early fathers must surely have had a sense of humour, as it was to be the Ipswich-bound Cobb & Co. coach, the last vehicle to cross the ill-fated wooden bridge, which led the procession across the new structure. The bridge served its purpose well. Tolls were levied. Pedestrians a penny, horse-drawn vehicles 1 shilling, and a charge of 6pence for each extra horse. It cost a halfpenny to take a sheep across, but dogs were free. After the bridge had served for almost 19 years, it was subjected to the worst deluge Brisbane has ever seen. On the afternoon of February the 5th, 1893, the populace of Brisbane gathered to watch the swollen waters that was still building, racing downstream past the city centre. The mood was tense. This flood was greater than the previous worst of 1869. Overnight, the rain teemed down. The river continued to swell, and when daylight came, these 3 vessels had been washed up into what is now the Botanic Gardens. But far more seriously, the northern end of the city's only river crossing was gone. The weight of thousands of tons of debris, logs, whole barns, fencing and furniture had piled against the bridge pillars and sent the half nearest the city crashing into the raging waters. It was a disaster for Brisbane. The everyday lives of many who lived on the south side were thrown into chaos. Business and commerce were severely affected. Slowly, the water levels dropped, and Brisbane realised the bridge would have to be repaired. Work began straight away on a temporary wooden structure to join the northern end of what remained of the bridge to the shore. And in just 7 months, the link was completed, opening in September 1893. But raging floods in the Brisbane River were to bring more devastation and tragedy in the not-too-distant future. On February the 12th, 1896, just 3 years later, floodwaters had again swept tons of debris downstream. There were fears that the temporary wooden structure would collapse, and gangs of men worked feverishly to clear more than a hectare of matted branches and logs jamming the bridge area. Several of the main wooden supports were damaged, one so badly the bridge settled more than a metre. On the morning of February the 13th, it was closed to traffic. A small steamer, the Pearl, which usually plied the river between the city and the river mouth, was brought into service to carry passengers across the still swollen river. After narrowly escaping an accident earlier in the day, the Pearl was taking on board passengers for the 5 p.m. crossing to the South Bank. Most of the people were anxious to get on board, so much so that police actually had to hold the crowd back. But eventually, the small steamer sailed with about 70 passengers on board. As she chugged slowly across the river, the current picked her up and pushed her towards the steamship Normanby. Unable to manoeuvre, she brushed against the stern of the Normanby, and for some unknown reason, the captain of the Pearl stopped her engines. In a split second, the raging current took hold of the steamer and smashed her into the anchor chains of the yacht Lucinda, which was moored in the river. The smaller boat was smashed to pieces and sank like a stone. Workmen on the bridge raised the alarm, but in the raging deluge, rescues were pretty well impossible. The smashed hull of the Pearl was recovered from the river, but it was a fortnight before the last of the dead was found. Some bodies were found on sandbanks in Moreton Bay. A coroner's report placed the death toll at 30, but at least another 20 who were never accounted for were presumed dead. It was Australia's worst ever river disaster. In March of 1894, a tender was accepted for the construction of a new bridge across the river. The days of temporary bridges were gone. It was opened in June 1897 by Lord Lamington. The bridge of 1897 carried Brisbane's traffic from the city to South Brisbane until 1969, when the current Victoria Bridge was opened. Part of that second permanent bridge was, however, kept. It now sits on an island of its own at the southern end of the new bridge. While in itself it's a reminder of Brisbane's battle with the river, it also carries a reminder of another chapter of history associated with the bridge. In this 1924 photograph of the southern end of the bridge, there's a plaque. It was erected as a result of a little-known tragedy that occurred near that spot in June of 1918. It was a cool Sunday evening in June of 1918. Darkness had fallen when 11-year-old Hector Vasili and several of his friends gathered here to watch a parade of diggers invalided home from the fields of Flanders. The wounded soldiers, driven in civilian cars, passed over the bridge at about 6 o'clock. Some reports say that Hector had bought gifts of chocolate and cigarettes from his father's oyster bar to give to the soldiers. Others said he tried to pick up a piece of wattle thrown by the homecoming soldiers. The inquest was told Hector was hit by a car and thrown into the rails of the bridge, in all probability hitting his head on the gutter when he fell. A small 11-year-old may well have been forgotten at the end of a turmoil like World War I, but he is still remembered, with Anzac Day services held at the plaque every year.
So redevelopment is just the latest in a long line of dramatic changes on the south bank of the river. Clearing for the expo site was the most dramatic change, and many would say improvement, to that part of Brisbane in almost 100 years. But the South Bank has played a vital role in the city's development. For more than a century before Expo, it was a hive of industry, with sailing clippers and barks from all over the world tying up at its bank. Along with the city reach of the river, it made up Brisbane's port, literally right in the heart of the city. The presence of so many sailing vessels on that part of the river helped to create one of Brisbane's most spectacular and prominent features. The steep vertical rock face across the river from the Botanic Gardens, generally known as the Kangaroo Point Cliffs, are, contrary to common belief, not a natural phenomenon, but man-made. Having delivered their cargoes to the wharves of Brisbane, many vessels sailed empty and therefore required ballast to offset the weight of masts and sails and to ensure that they remained stable at sea. The ballast for many of those ships was rock mined from the cliffs area, which was known as the Kangaroo Point Quarry. In December of 1864, the Reverend James Moffat, who lived beside the current St Mary's Church directly above the quarry, complained to the Minister for Works that the Brisbane Municipal Council was allowing John Petrie, who rented the quarry, to operate in what he called a sickly manner. He said that his home was being shaken to its centre and that there were showers of stones several times a day. As well, he complained that because the stone was being used for ballast, sailors were passing his house day and night on their way from the ships to the flesh pots of Kangaroo Point. But the stone from the cliffs, known as Brisbane tuff, did serve purposes which no doubt Reverend Moffat would have found more honourable. 40 years before his complaint, the stone had been a vital building material in the penal settlement of Brisbane. Between 1825 and 1842, Brisbane tuff was used to build the commissariat stores in William Street. The building is one of only 2 original convict buildings still in existence. Tuff was also used to build the retaining wall around it in 1828-29. With steam rapidly taking over from sail, in 1884 the Railways Department completed a branch line from the South Brisbane Yards, now the site of the Government Printing Office, to the railway coal wharves and sidings. The wharves extended around the curve in the river from the city side of the present Captain Cook Bridge almost to the dry dock. Steam-powered cranes were used to load coal on board the ships. It was used for fuel as well as being one of the state's earliest exports. In the early 1900s, an electric hoist and gantry was used. It had a moving boom, and it was the forerunner of the giant conveyor belt systems which were to be developed later. Between 1884 and 1893, over 1 million tonnes of coal was exported from the very heart of the city. Today, the only reminders of the place where Queensland's first major export left the country are the bases of the heavy steam cranes that once loaded the coal aboard the foreign traders. But even the cranes were put out of action by the swirling waters of floods, which constantly harassed industries established beside the river. The cliffs area was quarried right up until 1976. The stone was taken by barge from here along the river to the projects on which it was used. Now, they included much of the flood mitigation work which followed the flood disaster of 1974, also the Fisherman's Island port development and the Manly boat harbour. But despite the presence of so much rock, there was one project not far from here in which not one piece of stone was used. Just around the curve in the river from the coal wharves is the old dry dock, now the home of the Queensland Maritime Museum. During the early settlement of Queensland, Brisbane was its lifeline. Ships which loaded here served all of Queensland's northern cities as well as the Torres Strait Islands. Steamers like the Quetta, pictured here in September 1886, also sailed from Brisbane to Europe in the days before aircraft shortened the journey from weeks to days and finally to hours. In 1875, almost 300 vessels used the port, and the need was seen for a graving dock to repair and maintain the constant flow of traffic. When the dock was begun in 1875, the contractors were given 3 years to complete the task. But due to the unsuitability of local stone, work wasn't completed until 1881, with this Lockyer Creek freestone being quarried some 120 miles away near Helidon. Along the way, the dry dock didn't only serve as a ship repair facility, but became the centre for sporting pursuits. Before the days of modern pools, it hosted swimming carnivals and school sports days right up until the 1920s. In the 1940s, the railway line didn't end here at Ferny Grove. It wound its way out towards Samford and up the valley to Dayborough. The path the line once took is now a roadway through developing Samford area. The brick culverts and cuttings are still there. On Monday, 5th of May 1947, just before 9 a.m, a picnic train organised by the Customs and Excise Department Social Club left Central Station. With nearly 500, mostly women and children on board, it wound its way toward Closeburn, where the picnic was to be held. Here, by the side of a country road, a simple plaque now marks the spot just over 15 kilometres from Brisbane, where the lead carriage jumped the rails as the train rounded a left-hand corner. The weight of the carriages at the rear of the train crushed the forward cars. The unfortunate day trippers at the front of the train bore the brunt of the carnage. An emergency rescue gang made up of local farmers and shopkeepers was on the scene within minutes. They and emergency service workers struggled to free the victims from the splintered wreckage. 15 picnickers died and another 30 were seriously injured in what was Queensland's worst rail accident. These days, the sight of massive jetliners in the skies over Brisbane is pretty much taken for granted. But it's not that long ago since those who talked of taking to the skies in machines that would fly were regarded as charlatans, as hoaxes, or at best as foolish dreamers. Brisbane's first flight of any type took place at the exhibition grounds just over 100 years ago. A young lady who'd worked in a circus as part of an act called the Van Tassel Sisters ascended beneath a hot air balloon here at the grounds in May 1890. Much to the amazement of the crowd, who'd parted with their hard-earned cash to see the amazing feat, she rose into the air on a trapeze and from about 800 feet dropped back to earth by parachute. The Van Tassel sister landed near what we now know as the Children's Hospital. But the first heavier-than-air flight in Brisbane wasn't to come for another 20 years. By 1910, Bert Hinkler was developing a glider in Bundaberg. One Roland Bowen was hard at work on a glider on Moreton Island, and a Brisbane barrister by the name of Tom McLeod had been experimenting with a glider on this piece of land, owned by a family called Cinnamon on 17 Mile Rocks Road at Oxley. But it's almost certain that Brisbane's first heavier-than-air flight was here near the Children's Hospital. McLeod must have had a sense of history, as it's the exact location where the Van Tassel sister had landed by parachute 20 years earlier. The records show that on October the 11th, 1910, the wind speed averaged more than 35 kilometres an hour. and that McLeod made several dry runs before soaring into the air to the delight of the onlookers. But one heavier-than-air flight had not dragged Brisbane into the age of aviation. While Hinkler had hoped to put a small engine in a later glider, the honour of Brisbane's first powered flight went to an American called Arthur Wizard Stone. Stone was already the first heavier-than-air flyer in Queensland after 2 flights at Rockhampton, the second in a contest around O'Callaghan Park racetrack against a motor car. That was on May 31st, 1912. But it wasn't until July of that year that Stone returned to Brisbane for what was billed as an exhibition of marvellous monoplane manoeuvres. Stone took off from the exhibition ground about 4:05 on the afternoon of July 6, 1912, and having circled the ground 3 times, flew off to find somewhere to land. The main oval here at the exhibition ground, even in those days, had a grandstand along one side. The field itself was really little more than a natural depression in the surrounding countryside. Getting an aeroplane off the ground here was not all that difficult, but landing one, that was a different story. Wizard Stone had already had difficulties with that. This is all that remained of his propeller after a second landing attempt at Rockhampton. And when he took off from here to look for another landing place, he probably had the Albion Park racetrack in mind. Unfortunately, the races were on that Saturday afternoon, so the Wizard had to attempt a landing back here. He glided in from the direction of Bowen Hills, but the approach was too steep. The nose of the aircraft dug into the ground, causing severe damage. But fortunately, no injury to the Wizard. For the next 2 years, Queenslanders slowly became used to the sight of aircraft in the skies over their cities. One man in particular, Arthur Jones from Warwick, took his aircraft to many country centres. He caused much excitement when he completed the first flight the residents of Cairns had ever seen in his Caudron biplane on July 28, 1914. But it wasn't until after the First World War and the influence of men who'd learned to fly because of it that Brisbane became the centre of much of what was happening in Australian aviation. After the war and into the early 20s, aircraft used a number of landing fields around Brisbane. They were basically any area of dry, flat ground with approaches not hindered by trees. Racetracks were favoured for their long straights. Those early flyers landed at Kedron Park Racecourse. This landing field at Bulimba was popular with the operators of joy flights in a BE-2E in 1920. There was another field at St Lucia, which was home to this Sopwith New, which also carried advertising for a brand of popular soap. And there was also what we now know as Windsor Park in Maine, then known as Albion Flats. In 1921, Bert Hinkler, now a fully fledged pilot having served with the Royal Air Force in Europe, returned to Brisbane from his homecoming in Bundaberg in this Avro baby. He landed at Albion Flats. At the time, another First World War flyer, Frank Roberts, was using Albion Flats as his base of operations. Here, his Avro 504 is landing from the east after crossing the railway line. A plaque on the main Australian rules sheds at Windsor Park is the only reminder of the days when aviation was in its infancy and Albion Flats was at its centre. It wasn't until 1922 that Eagle Farm, still a paddock in those days, became Brisbane's official airport. But on many occasions proved unsuitable to the task due to rain which turned it into a quagmire. On those occasions, operations reverted to what had been the preferred airfield prior to the establishment of Eagle Farm, the Fort Lytton landing ground. Now, Fort Lytton was built near the mouth of the Brisbane River in 1880 to guard its low reaches. It was popular as a landing field with early flyers because it was sited on government-owned land, which afforded security and guaranteed access. It was still used as an alternative when Eagle Farm became waterlogged as late as the 1930s, when Australian National Airways, the airline founded by Sir Charles Kingsford Smith, flew its Avros from Lytton. The landing ground had at least one famous passenger, British aviatrix Amy Johnson. She'd crashed on landing at Eagle Farm in May of 1930. Even though she was unhurt, she was advised not to fly and was flown as a passenger to Sydney from Fort Lytton. Bert Hinkler was to return to Brisbane this time after completing an amazing solo flight from England, arriving in March of 1928. In the days before his arrival, the city was drenched by several heavy downpours and Eagle Farm Aerodrome was awash. Hinkler was forced to land his Avro Avian on the Ascot racetrack, now known as Eagle Farm Racecourse. But while Hinkler had arrived from Europe, Kingsford Smith was soon to make another historic landing in Brisbane, arriving after crossing the Pacific from the United States on June the 9th of the same year. Smithy, who was born in Brisbane in 1897, landed at Eagle Farm, where his aircraft, the Southern Cross, is now on permanent display. Another reminder of Brisbane's rich history. At the rear of the Commonwealth Centre in Ann Street stands this mysterious device. Most of those who pass it every day have no idea of the origins of this strange, cone-like contraption. It's a distant reminder of the great drought of 1902, when the state was suffering extreme conditions. A meteorologist by the name of Clement Wragg introduced what he called the Steiger vortex gun in an attempt to break the drought. As there were no planes available, his idea was to seed the clouds from below by blasts of hot air. Some of the guns, like this one, were recovered in Charleville in 1947. The date on it is wrong. The gun was used on the 2nd of September, 1902. Unfortunately, after it was fired, no rain fell, and Clement Wragg then became known as Inclement Wragg.
Many of Brisbane's special places are not monuments to the famous or infamous, but rather they commemorate the deeds of ordinary people who've lived here. Every day we pass by these silent reminders, often without knowing they're there. Each one of them tells its own story, like this small plaque on a rock beside a quiet suburban street in St John's Wood. It lies beneath a tall kauri pine as a tribute to Flight Sergeant Clifford Burger Hopgood, an Australian airman killed in air operations over Europe in February of 1944. Just 27 years of age, he and 3 others from his Royal Air Force Lancaster bomber died when it was shot down over France while on a bombing mission to Germany. The other 4 aircrew survived. These fading photographs, taken by the French resistance, show the crashed aircraft near the village of Villers-sous-Prenay, about 4 hours' drive from Paris. The resistance not only took the photographs, but despite threats from their German occupiers, made coffins for the dead flyers and conducted a funeral service to which hundreds of villagers turned up, risking their own lives in the process. In the early 70s, Cliff Hopgood's widow, Margaret, was able to visit the French village where her husband died to lay a wreath on his grave near a monument flying the Australian and French flags. Even 30 years after the tragedy, most of the village came out to meet the wife of a foreigner from a far-off land who died fighting for their freedom. She also met the doctor who tended her husband and the priest who conducted the burial service. Today, Margaret Hopgood still finds it hard to talk about her husband's death, but lives where she'll never be far away from the monument erected to his memory by his friends. 8 men from St John's Wood saw service in World War II. Cliff Hopgood was the only one who didn't return. There are also the reminders of those who towered on the world stage, like this ornate headstone here in the Toowong Cemetery, which marks the final resting place of one of the greatest boxers of the last century. Peter Jackson was a West Indian who came to live in Australia in 1867. He never won a world title, but in 1891 he faced Gentleman Jim Corbett in a fight to the finish in San Francisco, it generally being agreed that the winner would take on world champion John L. Sullivan. At the end of 61 rounds, the bare-knuckle bloodbath was declared a draw, as Gentleman Jim, Jackson and the referee were all exhausted. But it was Corbett who was to get the title bout with Sullivan, as the champion said he'd never fight a black man. The following year, 1892, Corbett was to take the crown from Sullivan in the first heavyweight championship fight where boxers wore gloves. Jackson, injured during a fight with Australian Frank Slavin in London, also in 1892, returned to Australia suffering consumption or tuberculosis. He lived in Roma for a short time, but finally died a horrible coughing death on July the 13th, 1901, at the age of 40. His supporters erected this elaborate monument over his grave, and on one side there's a verse, said to have been written by journalist James Maxwell Ramsey, who was an avid boxing fan and sub-editor with the now-defunct Brisbane Evening Standard. Not far from Peter Jackson's grave, there's another with obvious connections to boxing. It's that of fight referee Pat Hill, who died in 1958. So well loved was Pat Hill that his friends erected this headstone and ring on his grave when he died. Photographs of him are rare, most having been destroyed when Festival Hall was inundated in the flood of 1974. But this one surviving shot shows Pat in action at the Brisbane Stadium in 1950. As a referee, Pat was legendary. So much so that when the new venue for boxing, Festival Hall, took over from the Brisbane Stadium in 1959, a photo of Pat Hill was placed in the floor below the ring.
It was 1942 when the sirens, as well as the headlines, screamed the possibility of Japanese air attack on southern mainland cities. Already, Darwin had been bombed. And on the night of Sunday, May 31st, 3 Japanese midget submarines were sunk in Sydney Harbour. The country went on alert. Newspaper advertisements warned of the penalties of not observing the blackout. Even street lamps were fitted with smaller lights to limit their visibility from the air. In the country's parks, air raid shelters were hastily prepared. Air raid wardens were appointed. Their task was to make sure precautions were followed and to control what limited firefighting equipment was available at the time. Even in suburban backyards, families went to work to ensure that if the Japanese menace decided to attack southern cities, they'd be prepared. Again, the local air raid warden was responsible for ensuring the completed shelters were likely to be safe, rather than a tomb for the occupants in case of attack. As the air raids came closer to the populated areas of Australia, the whole nation wondered what was in the mind of the Japanese aggressor. There was a national alert, and municipal authorities were obliged to build public shelters in areas where people may have been at the time of an attack. On Christmas Eve of 1941, the Brisbane City Council was ordered by the Commonwealth Government to build at least 200 blast-proof shelters in populated areas around the city. This photo from the Courier Mail of Saturday, January 3rd, 1942, shows a line of air raid shelters built along the centre of Elizabeth Street, almost finished. As well as shelters, heavy piping was laid along the roadway to carry water from the river as an emergency firefighting measure. Shelters were built all around the city. These in Ann Street were just up the road from the Masonic Temple, which can be seen with its doorway heavily protected by sandbags. But the reminders of those days are still with us. Many of the council-built shelters were designed to be converted to bus shelters, like this one on North Quay. Part of the old structure is still visible at the back of the building. Factories and places of work built shelters. This one still remains intact at the old Dixon Shoe Factory in Montague Street, South Brisbane.
And because the residents of Brisbane firmly believed that their city could be attacked at any time without warning, almost everywhere there would be people, there was an air raid shelter. A few, like this one at Park Road Station, still remain, passed every day by thousands of commuters, most of whom have no appreciation of the comfort that was offered by these crude shelters back in the dark days of 1942.
And, of course, there was one other place where people gathered to boost their spirits in wartime Brisbane, the pubs. And in those days, a regular part of the scenery around Brisbane hotels was the bomb shelter. Most are now gone, but some, like this one at the Broadway Hotel in Woolloongabba, serve as a reminder of precautions taken, which fortunately never had to be used. The history of Brisbane is all around us. Some of it is obvious, like Oakwall, the Georgian-style sandstone house built between 1858 and 1864 for Daniel Somerset. The house has been home to a Chief Justice and a Premier and has been in the same family for generations. But just down the hill from Oakwall is the kind of history which is easily missed. On a corner block which, in the 1800s, was probably at the extremity of the Oakwall property, stands a tiny house which has the claim of occupying the smallest residential block in the city. It was built in 1896 and sits on just 2.9 perches, or less than 75 square metres. It's said the block was set aside to house Oakwall's coach driver. The house that now stands here was originally just one room and two verandas. Former Army Warrant Officer Tom O'Brien bought the property back in 1956 when it looked like this. Tom, who's added his own touches to the tiny house, can't remember exactly how much he paid for the place, but he thinks it was about £300, $600. He's had numbers of offers for his unique home. In some cases, he's been asked to name his own price. But for Tom O'Brien, the history attached to his unique home is more important than any money.
Stay with us. Next, Cameron Daddo stars in the new hit drama series Boney, followed by your Academy Award-winning Saturday night movie. Brad Davis and Randy Quaid star in Midnight Express, tonight on 7.